Good afternoon and welcome to Fridays at 1, and thank you for joining us today. Fridays at 1 is sponsored by the Lifelong Peer Learning Program, or LP Square, at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm Carolyn Setlow. I'm one of about 300 members of LP Square, and I'm also co-chair of the committee that plans our Fridays at 1 speakers program. The CUNY Graduate Center is the postgraduate degree conferring institute within the City University of New York system. Our campus is located in Midtown Manhattan. LP Square is a non-degree program of the Graduate Center. It's a vibrant learning community of adult learners. Admitted members teach and learn from each other, in addition to organizing activities and special events. If you are retired or semi-retired and would like to learn more, please visit us at www.lp2nyc.org. lp2nyc.org. Click on Join Us and submit your contact details to receive more information. We offer Fridays at 1, our speakers program, about 6 times during the academic year. These are public programs open at no cost to the CUNY community and also to the general public. These programs are funded by LP2 members, LP Square members, by their donations to the IER, which is the Institute for Education and Retirement, the nonprofit arm of LP Square. This is one way that LP Square gives back to its community. We invite well-known speakers in the arts, sciences, and public affairs for conversations with one of our members, followed by Q&A. Now, today, I have the pleasure of passing the virtual mic to Pamela Goldberg. Pamela is a fellow member of LP Square and also a member of the Fridays at 1 committee. She'll have the pleasure of welcoming and interviewing today's guest. You're on, Pamela.
Thank you, Carolyn, and hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. It's my great privilege to welcome to Fridays at 1 our guest, Rachel Swarns. Rachel Swarns is a journalist, author, and associate professor of journalism at New York University. She writes about race and race relations as a contributing writer for the New York Times, where she served as a reporter and correspondent for 22 years. Her articles about Georgetown University's roots in slavery, which is what we're going to talk about today, touched off a national conversation about American universities and their ties to this painful period of history. She is the author of the 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church. She also has written American Tapestry, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama. And she's a co-author of Unseen, unpublished Black history from the New York Times photo archives. The 272 was selected as one of the notable books of 2023 by the New York Times Book Review, The New Yorker, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and Kirkus Reviews. It won a 2024 Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers and was one of 24 books longlisted for the 2024 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. Her work has been recognized and supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, the Biographers International Organization, the Leon Levy Center for Biography, the McDowell Artist Residency Program, and others. In 2023, she was elected to the Society of American Historians, and in 2024, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So I'm going to start our conversation with Rachel, and please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to those later on in the program. So Rachel, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'd like to start at the beginning of this story. Who were the 272? How did you find out about them? And what prompted you to write a book about them?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It really is a pleasure to be here. And yeah, the 272, well, it all got started as these things often do with a tip, you know. A colleague of mine who is a business reporter at the New York Times got an email from a Georgetown alum who was pitching us on a story about 272 men, women, and children who had been sold by some of the nation's most prominent Catholic priests to save their biggest mission project, which was the school we now know as Georgetown University. And, my colleague was, intrigued by this, but also like, is this a story? Because this was back in 2016, before the 1619 project. And so, this was a time when newspapers focused mostly on, the present day and here and now. And so, she wasn't even sure, a slave sale from 1838, is that a story for us? And I always say that I'm super grateful that she didn't delete the email, and she didn't because she remembered that there was someone on the staff who might know. She remembered about my book, American Tapestry, which traced the journey of Michelle Obama's ancestors from slavery to the White House in 5 generations. And she thought, okay, well, maybe she might know if this is something worth covering. And so she forwarded the email to me, and I knew right away that this was a story. My work on Michelle Obama's family had allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families, and I could see immediately that this was the next step in the kind of work that I wanted to do, exploring how slavery shaped some of our American institutions. So I knew it was a story, but I was also super flabbergasted because Catholic priests enslaved people. Catholic priests bought and sold people. I happen to be Black and Catholic myself, and I had no idea. And so I really wanted to know more about these priests and more about these families. And I started with an article in the New York Times and kept digging and digging and digging and ended up writing a book about the 272, these families who were sold.
So just your interest and fascination is what led you to keep moving from the article and diving in deeper to go on into the story. That's great. And I think a lot of us, I'm sure more so than you, were greatly surprised about this huge role that the Catholic Church, and particularly the Jesuits, who are kind of the intellectual,
Right.
passionate group that kind of stands out.
Social justice guys, right? Yeah.
Exactly, yes. So,
Yeah.
it's a very fascinating story you tell. And you frame the story through the lens of the Mahoney family, and you start off with Anne Joyce, who is considered to be the family matriarch. And she came to Maryland around 1634. You write a beautiful and haunting passage about her. You say she would have no wealth, no land, and no savings to leave her family, but she still had her story. That story would be her legacy. So, in view of that, it gives me the chills just reading it out loud. So, what can you tell us about her role as a family matriarch, how all this came about through her?
Yeah. I wanted to, when I was thinking about, how to write about this and how to tell this story, I'm always trying to find ways to bring readers in, and being aware too that, we're in a time when, for some people, slavery right away is just gonna, no, thank you, not interested. How to bring people in. And I thought, 272 people were sold, scores of families, I would write about one. And the Mahoney family, I wanted to write about because their experience really paralleled the emergence of the Catholic Church, first in the British colonies with the first priests arriving in 1634, and then the church's growing reliance on plantations and slave labor. And so, as you say, I start with Anne Joyce, who comes to Maryland in the late 1600s, and she arrives like many people did at the time as an indentured servant. And we all know a little bit about indentured servants, who came to the colonies with a contract and a term of years to work, and then they would go on their way. And she certainly hoped that too. She was a Black woman who came as an indentured servant. But she came at a time when Maryland, established in part as a refuge for Catholics who experienced discrimination in England. She arrived at a time when Maryland was transitioning from a colony that relied extensively on indentured labor to one that was relying almost entirely on slave labor. And her contract was burned. She was forced into slavery, and she lost everything. Everything, except, as you point out from that section of the book, everything but her story. And she told that story to all of the white people around her, her children and her grandchildren, and her descendants tell that story. And the story is a simple one. Our liberty was stolen and we should be free people. And that really sets the course for this family's journey across time. She is forced into slavery by Catholic gentry, in Maryland. And over time, her descendants become the property of Jesuit priests in Maryland.
So you took her story and turned her oral history into a written narrative that you could then expand how you talked about her and her life and her descendants, which is a very a kind of amazing thing to do. And what I'd like now, since we've been talking about her as the beginning point, we know that this family develops over time, expands, and as your book grows. So could you give us a kind of a sketch or timeline of who the key family members were and sort of how they evolved in the story?
Sure, sure. And one of the things is, I should say, is that, doing this kind of work is super difficult, so I am mining as many sources as I can. The oral histories, which are described in court records, which I'll talk a little bit about later, um, uh, census records, property records, but there are, all kinds of records, sacramental records. Um, Enslaved people, were barred by law and practice from, learning to read and write. So, the letters and journals and that people rely on, historians rely on for, these kinds of time periods are really scarce. So there are lots of gaps, lots of questions I can't answer, lots of things that I wonder about. So I say that to say that there's much I know about the family and much that I don't. So Anne Joyce, arrives in the late 1600s. We know that she has descendants who are who kill an overseer and who are executed. In the 1700s, she has descendants beyond that in the late 1700s who take the Jesuits to court to try to garner their freedom. And that's in the late 1700s. And then I take the family to the Mahoneys of the 19th century. Harry Mahoney, during the War of 1812, saves the church's wealth and is rewarded for his courage and loyalty with a promise from the Jesuits, a promise that neither he nor his family would ever be sold. And that promise is broken in that sale of 1838. And Harry Mahoney's children, he has a number of children who end up being sold. But I principally talk about the story of two of his daughters, Louisa and Anna, who are separated by that sale.
Interesting. So I have some questions I'd like to talk with you about a little later. But since you brought up the idea of bringing cases in court, and that some of her descendants participated in that, what exactly, how could they bring these lawsuits if they were enslaved or indentured? What kind of, how could they prevail? How could, and what would they, in practical terms, what would they gain from if they do prevail on a lawsuit?
Right. So, after the Revolutionary War, enslaved people were very aware of, all the soaring rhetoric that came with all of that, the call for independence and freedom and equality. And after the Civil War, hundreds of enslaved people went to the courts and said, we should be free people. Many of them made claims on the basis that they had had an ancestor, a freeborn ancestor. This is the case, for instance, in the Mahoney family, that someone in the family was forced into freedom, or that they had a Native American ancestor who was free, or a white ancestor who was free. And a number of these families prevailed in court. And this was a time when also enslavers, thinking about this new country and the ideals, also were freeing people too, saying, there are real problems here, contradictions in what we are saying and what we are practicing on the ground. And so members of the Mahoney family, Charles Patrick Mahoney, took the Jesuits to court, went to the courthouse. Members of the family testified in court, told the story of Anne Joyce. The Jesuits grumbled about this, grumbled about having to pay lawyers to defend themselves. And in this instance, this was a long and quite torturous legal proceeding with appeals, etc. And the Mahoneys did not prevail. The priest who enslaved them ended up freeing a number of them, but many of the Mahoneys, who were hoping that this would set a precedent that would not only free the people who filed the lawsuit, but the extended family, who were also descended from Anne Joyce, remained enslaved. And so you have this split in the family between free and enslaved people after that.
So that's interesting. Two things. One is what you just said about how the split in the family, and did they completely diverge? Did they find ways to keep in contact or have some kind of familial bond?
So, I don't know a lot about that. There were people, so there were those Mahoneys who were freed after that lawsuit. There's another Mahoney, a close, perhaps a brother, we're not sure, of Harry Mahoney, the one I mentioned, who played that role in the War of 1812, who purchased his freedom, who worked and earned money and purchased his freedom. And he ended up moving to Philadelphia, and members of the Mahoney family ended up in Philadelphia. And there are reports about him coming back, and his kind of fear and terror of coming back because of the dangers of free people finding themselves forced back into slavery. So there's certainly some indications that, at least for a time, the branches of the family stayed connected.
So the other thing you just said a minute ago was about that some of the enslaved people were freed. And so they're complaining about the fees. They don't want to go. A lot of the cases are lost anyway. What motivated them to just say, okay, well, they just wanted to settle the case? Or...
It's such an, I don't know the answer. It's a really interesting question about that. This particular priest was at one time a very powerful a Jesuit priest, but he, you know, his reputation was tarnished because there were whispers about him and his relationship with an enslaved woman on the plantation, and children that this woman had. And so, you know, I guess the short answer is that I don't know why he freed them. It may have been, as you suggested, to wipe your hand, you know, wipe their hands of his hands of this, you know, to kind of have these folks out of his hair in some way. There's been some suggestion that maybe they paid him or something too, you know. So, but we don't know why he ended up after all that time. You know, is at least more than a decade, or around a decade, that he decided to free them. We don't know.
So this brings up one of the comments you just made, brings up another question that I've been wondering about, which, you know, we know of so many famous people, historic people who had affairs with Black women, who abused them. And so among the Jesuits or the Catholic Church in general, but it's hard to imagine that that really happened. But did it happen? Is there any known kind of record of that, or of mixed race children from that?
In this particular instance, as I mentioned, you know, there are letters. The Jesuits themselves talked about these rumors, and in fact, he left property to this woman and her children, which is very suggestive of something more than you know, simple ownership, you know, as it were. And you know, and actually what would be interesting, but I don't know, I believe that there may have been, or there was some consideration of DNA testing. And you know, and I don't know, because there are many descendants of that family. The Mahoneys filed lawsuits. The Queens, another family, who also, there were ancestors sold in this sale in 1838 too, also filed lawsuits. They're descendants of the Queen family, and I think at some point there was talk of DNA testing, you know, and I don't know whether or not that has actually happened or not.
So what, how did the Jesuits first get involved with slavery, with buying slaves? Presumably they bought them, and ultimately, which we'll get to a little bit later, selling them. How did they get involved in this?
You know, as I mentioned, it was happening kind of organically at the time, you know, in Maryland, and they ended up being very large landholders, plantation holders. The order did in Maryland, and the I mentioned that there were that Catholics faced discrimination in England, but they did in Maryland too, ultimately. And you know, one thing that happened was that they made it difficult for folks to bring in Irish Catholic indentured laborers. And so that probably helped, you know, push this shift along, which was happening anyway. You have to remember too that enslaved people were property essentially, and so the Jesuits, Catholic folks would bequeath property to the church, including people, and so the Jesuits inherited people as well as purchased people.
So,
And they ended up being, which is important to know, among the largest slaveholders in Maryland.
uh, so how they use the enslaved people to help develop their land, and their primary goal, at least on paper, was to help build Georgetown University and other places of education, institutions of education. Of course, there was also, as you talk about, there was the personal greed and all of the, misuse of funds and all of those things that we can talk about yesterday and today and tomorrow. But taking all that into account, why they wanted the slaves there, to develop the land, to earn the money so they could develop their academic institutions. How did they treat the people that they owned, that they considered their property?
Yeah, and I want to back up because that's a really good point. I mean, we have to remember that, the Catholic Church is, is growing over time, and really, the priests are relying on, um, slave sales and slave labor to build the church itself. Um, so priests who relied on slave sales and plantations and enslaved laborers established the nation's first Catholic archdiocese, established the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown, helped to establish some of the nation's first Catholic convents, helped to build the nation's first Catholic cathedral in Baltimore. Priests who operated a plantation and sold people helped to establish the nation's first Catholic seminary. So the very underpinnings of the Catholic Church in the United States were built by priests who relied on slavery. And your question as to how they treated people, they often talked about themselves, comparatively speaking, to other enslavers in kind terms. They describe themselves as much more benevolent and kind enslavers. And it is certainly true that um, at least they said that they cared about the sacraments, making sure that people could marry, and that they could be baptized and take advantage of the sacraments of the church. In fact, it's a crazy kind of dynamic to think about, but the priests, unlike other white people, some other white people at the time, they did not, view enslaved people as animals or brutes or anything like that. They didn't. They viewed them as people, human beings with souls that they, as priests, had an obligation to nurture. At the same time that they felt comfortable with buying and selling their bodies and breaking up families, because even though they talked about the importance of keeping husband and wife and families together, that often did not happen. And so in terms of conditions, there are stories in the archives. There are records that describe, children sold without their parents, a girl swapped for a horse, pregnant women being whipped. There's a record from a letter from the 1820s that describes the housing that enslaved people were relegated to as almost universally unfit for human habitation. So, on the one hand, there was this understanding that these are human beings that we're dealing with here, human beings whose you know, immortal souls we have to tend, yet they were enslavers just like other people.
Right. So, a question I have about that I've been wondering about, I assume that some of the people coming from Africa brought their own religious traditions or spiritual traditions. And how did that, I'm assuming that's correct, but you can tell me if I'm off the track. But assuming that's true, what happened with those practices? Did they fold them together? Did they rebel against the Catholicism so they could try to maintain them? How did that happen?
And so, you know, a mix of things. I'm not an expert, but certainly a mix of things. You know, the priests, it was clear, I think, to people that there was a cost to not joining in to the church of the folks who were enslaving you, these Jesuit priests. There is an instance that I describe in the book where, as punishment for a couple who, you know, disobeyed the moral code, it was infidelity. As a punishment, the priests sold their children. So there was a real sense that, you know, there could be a price to pay for not joining in, for not uh, um, being at least viewed as faithful. We also know that some people embraced the church. And we might talk a little bit about that later. Many of these families that I write about were very devoted to the church. And there are ways in which traditional West African beliefs kind of fit, you know, you could kind of merge them with this kind of, you know, notion of the saints, you know, and kind of fitting in some of the West African beliefs with the Catholic belief. So there's a mix of all of those things.
Okay. And so going back to what you were just saying a minute ago about on the one hand being benevolent and thinking of themselves as, you know, doing important work, bringing them into the faith, and yet they committed atrocities as any other slaveholder might do. How did they reconcile that, or did they even see that as something to be reconciled?
It's such an excellent question, and you know, that was one of the things that just really, like, I, again, you know, even as I felt like, oh, I'm kind of, you know, I'm a reasonably educated person, and I, you know, had written this book, so I had a little bit more information than your average person about slavery, and I just didn't know anything about this. And so you ask yourself, how in the world did they reconcile? How did men of God reconcile this, you know, these nurturing the soul and selling the body? Like, how did they square that circle? And you know, I would say that, you know, it's complicated. I mean, first of all, you know, of course, slavery was legal, right? It was legal in the colonies. It was legal in the United States. Um, it was the economic system of the time. And it's also important to know that Rome, you know, did not, while Rome did, you know, condemn the enslavement of the indigenous in the Americas, Rome was silent about the buying and selling of Black people for a long, long time. What I always say, though, is that it's really important to know that all along the way, there were priests who raised questions um, and concerns, and even challenged that mass sale of 272 men, women, and children that I write about in this book. And I say that, and I say that that's important to know, because when you're doing the kind of research that I'm doing and writing about the topics that I'm writing, I'm keenly aware that there are folks who will say, wait a second, don't bring your 21st century, ideas about justice and morality back to, the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, nothing to do with them. But the truth is that that's simply not the case, that there were priests, lonely voices, I always say, not a huge number, but there were priests who were raising these questions and concerns in real time.
So this brings up something that I've also been wondering about. You talk about Father Carberry. I'm mixing up his name.
Yes, Carberry, yeah.
And one of the things you touch on is that he had, I believe it was he who had this idea of giving some of the enslaved people their own land, treating them more like indentured servants than as slaves. And what can you tell us about that? What it meant, how it worked, why didn't it survive? Was, the kind of opposition, I suppose.
Father Carberry, for a while, it's like, Father Carberry is my guy. Goodness, Father Carberry. He was an interesting person because he was part of this American-born group of Jesuits. He knew slavery up close. He had relatives who enslaved people. But unlike some of the men who would become leaders of the Jesuits in Maryland, and presidents of Georgetown, he viewed the people on the plantation that he managed in a very different light. When he looked at those people, he saw capacity, he saw faith. And he writes about an enslaved man who builds a windmill and marvels at the craftsmanship. He gave the enslaved people on the plantation, at least some of them, remarkable freedoms for the time, allowing them to travel, to leave the plantation, grumbling a little bit about an enslaved guy who was staying a little longer somewhere than he had hoped he would. He talks about the faith of the people in this experiment that you describe. The Jesuits were often grumbling about, these enslaved people, and couldn't they work harder, and why aren't our plantations more profitable? And Carberry essentially said, well, maybe we should pay them. Like, that might get people to work. How about that? And so, yeah, so he parceled out some of the land on the plantation that he managed in St. Mary's County in Maryland, and said to families, listen, you run this as you see fit, plant what you see fit, harvest the way you see fit, and then at the end of the day, we will share in some of the profits. And when a senior Jesuit from Ireland who had visited that plantation in the 1820s came back in the 1830s after Father Carberry put this experiment into place, he marveled at the change. And Father Carberry was one of those people when he heard about the sale, this proposed sale of 272 people, almost all of the enslaved people who were enslaved by the Jesuits. He had everyone in his community, white and black, praying that it wouldn't happen. And then when that was clear that it wouldn't be enough, he went to Georgetown himself to voice his opposition to the sale. And when it was clear that that wouldn't be enough, and when the slave traders were, on their way on horseback approaching the plantation, he encouraged members of the Mahoney family to run. Again, a lonely voice. His attitude did not, did not prevail. These families were sold, but again, I think it's just really important to know that there was this divergence of opinion, and that there were priests who tried to find a different way.
Did any of the members of the Mahoney family try to run?
Yes. So I mentioned the two sisters, Harry Mahoney, who saves the church's wealth in 1812, has a family, has a number of children. I mentioned the two daughters, Louisa and Anna. And these two sisters were close. And again, when you're trying to research and write about enslaved people, it's so different. So you're kind of like threading little bits and pieces together. And I still remember the day when I realized, oh my goodness, they named their daughters after each other.
Oh,
And and so it was something that you could, so that was meaningful to them. They were meaningful to each other. And so when the slave traders come and the warning comes, Louisa, the younger sister, grabs her mother and runs to the woods. And Anna, the older sister, who had two young children, doesn't make it. And she's marched off to the ship and shipped off to Louisiana, and the two sisters never see each other again.
hmm. And so the ones who stayed, those were all of those are the ones who were ultimately sold. Is that's what?
So it's interesting. It's actually complicated. So the Jesuits sell on paper almost all of the enslaved people that they own, this 272 people. Most end up going to Louisiana, but a number are sold to local people as well in Maryland. And Louisa herself and then she later gets married and has children. And Louisa is I was going to say she's never sold. Actually, she was sold, but another thing that Father Carbery did was um, when the buyer came back to kind of gather up people, runaways and people, spouses who worked on other plantations, Father Carbery wanted to make sure that Louisa wouldn't be taken. So he paid for her so that she wouldn't be taken. So she remains. And there's a document from the 1860s which describes, some of the last people enslaved by the Jesuits, and she and her children are among them.
Oh. So tell us a little bit about what this whole thing meant to the people themselves, what they had to go through to be sold. What was that? I know it's a horrific experience having read that. I think out of all the book, that part affected me the most. And several times I just had to put the book down and go into a different room. So
Right.
with that in mind, what can you tell us about that experience for them?
Yeah, I always try, as a writer, I try to bring people into the experience as best as I can, recreate it with the documentation and the records that I have. And I certainly had that feeling too sometimes, Pamela. I remember still realizing, so it's 1838 that the sale is signed, is made. And Anna and the older sister is shipped off in November. But I remember when I realized actually that the sale itself took place in waves. Actually, there are two buyers. People are leaving not all at once, but at different times. And I remember realizing, oh my goodness, Anna and Louisa have a brother who is taken much earlier, and I'm forgetting now if it was June or July of 1838. So if you can imagine, and I certainly did, if you can imagine what it must have been like to know, because they did know that there was talk about this mass sale about to happen for a couple of years. Like I mentioned, Carberry's and other people are saying, oh, it shouldn't happen. There's this debate going on. The enslaved people know this too, and they know when they are sold. And then it happens, literally this brother of theirs is taken, him and his wife and his children, and any day, they're coming for you. When will it be? Will it be tomorrow when you wake up? Who will be next? Will it be your child? Will it be your cousin? Will it be your father? Living under those kinds of circumstances for months, it turns out, until they actually come. And the thing that sat with me for a while, and I have a son myself, right? And I would often talk to him about this, and I think about Father Carberry and about that warning that he gave, and like, what do you do? Like, you've got 5 minutes. Who do you take?
Right.
Who don't you take? It's just devastating. So I think one thing that's important to let people know, though, is that this story is I like to say this is hard history. There's no way around it. But it is also like a story of family and faith, and resilience and love too. People ask me, how do you keep doing this? Um, and we can talk about that. But these families, really, in part, it's because of that. It's because of their story, their resilience, their determination, their resistance, across time, that keeps me going. And also, like, I'm somebody who loves a good mystery. And so piecing together the story of these folks who, again, who have been largely left out, of the origin story that is traditionally told about the emergence of the American Catholic Church. It was both like the best hunt, in terms of being just piecing this together over time. And again, I just ended up feeling often just inspired by these families, and what they did to hold on, to each other and to their faith often too, which is remarkable that they did that under the circumstances.
It's very incredible. And I understand what you're saying about, with that strife and agony comes this resilience, this uplifting, that they kept going. They found a way to live through it, and through, in this particular case of the 272, through Anne Joyce's beginning of telling the story, they all could carry it with them as
That's right.
to help in some way give them hope, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
in this vein, you talked to us already a little bit about the promise that was made to them as a result of the Harry Mahoney's work during 1812 to help protect
Hmm.
the property and land of the Jesuits. The promise was made that they would never be separated or sold, but that promise was ultimately broken.
That's right.
Can you tell us how it was such a strong promise and it lasted for so many years? What was the factor
And
that caused it to
yeah.
break?
So I mentioned Father Carberry. I think it's important to mention someone else, which is Father Thomas Malady. And he, like Father Carberry, is part of this American born generation of Jesuit priests. Malady and others are sent to Rome to be educated, to become leaders of the Jesuits. And he comes back. He knows also slavery up close. His father enslaved people. He goes to Rome and he comes back, but he has this vision, and his vision is, he looks around and he says, this Catholic Church here, the future of this church is not what we've got, this rural plantation-based church. no, he's looking north. And when he looks north, what he sees is waves, waves and waves of immigrants, Catholic immigrants pouring into the cities. And he says, the future of the Catholic Church is there. And we, as Jesuits, have to position ourselves to support and nurture those newcomers and to establish a set of schools across the mid-Atlantic to support these newcomers. And, the Jesuits had chronic financial challenges for a number of reasons. Georgetown had chronic financial challenges for a number of reasons: enrollment up and down, kind of leadership up and down, mismanagement, some suggestions of corruption, embezzlement, all kinds of things. And also economic, the economy too, just like recessions and things like that. And so the only way that he could see to make this vision a reality was to do what many people did when they hit hard times, which was to sell off their assets. And in this case, it was these 272 men, women, and children. And so, it was, to build a dream, and and he was successful, and to save Georgetown, right? And they were successful. Georgetown survived, obviously. It's one of our elite universities. And the Jesuits were able to build a network of institutions that exist today, some of which are reckoning with this history and their ties to this history now. But it was the families like the Mahoneys who paid the price for this.
Right. So we're running out of time. I'm hoping that some of the things lingering in my mind that we couldn't possibly fit in an hour or an hour and a half. But so I want to go quickly to that groundbreaking article you wrote in the Times in 2016. The caption reads, and what you say in your piece is, and I quote, "What, if anything, is owed to the descendants of slaves who were sold to help ensure the college Georgetown's survival?" So you kind of put the lens on the idea of reparations. And what we know is that now Georgetown and some of the other schools have begun to make efforts towards that, towards trying to rectify or provide restitution or some form of recognition. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about what's been going on and how that seems?
Right. Yes. So Georgetown and the Jesuits, I'll start with them, both have apologized for their participation in the American slave trade. Georgetown has taken a number of steps renaming buildings that carried the names of some of the presidents, Milady included the one I just mentioned, who were involved in the slave trade, setting up an institute for the study of slavery. They also offered and have offered preference in admissions to descendants of people who were enslaved by the Jesuits. And a number of descendants have attended Georgetown through this program. They've established what they call a reconciliation fund. They're raising $400,000 a year toward projects that benefit descendant communities. And these grants, the second wave of grants just rolled out this year. It's an annual thing. And the Jesuits, for their part, have partnered with some descendant leaders to establish a foundation. They've promised to raise $100 million, again, to benefit these descendant communities for scholarships and other types of programs. It's the largest effort by the Roman Catholic Church to try to address and atone for this history. Though it's the fundraising has been slow going, and so they're still working on trying to raise that money. Loyola University Maryland in Baltimore has also done some work looking at its ties to this particular history. Holy Cross in Massachusetts as well. And then those schools actually, the financial ledgers document financial payments from the Jesuits to help establish those institutions, just like Thomas Milady hoped would happen. And some of the other institutions received support from the Jesuits in their foundings afterwards in different ways, with supplies and most importantly with leadership, faculty and staff. So that's what's happened in terms of these particular institutions.
And now what I understand is there's some 6,000 more or less descendants of the Mahoney family who have been identified and to the public and to among themselves. Is that?
So it's more than so when I first wrote that story, only a handful of descendants had been identified, a handful of descendants of the 272. So now there are more than 6,000 that descendants who have been identified, and that has been just an amazing thing that I don't think I envisioned when I first started writing about this. Many of them learned about their ties to Georgetown and the Jesuits through my reporting, and since then they have been pressing the institutions to address the history, and perhaps as importantly, they have been doing the work of stitching families that were torn apart more than 100 years ago back together. They are meeting on Zoom calls, they've had reunions. It's been really wonderful to see.
It's remarkable. It's the pebble in the pond. You threw the first pebble in and it keeps going out and out, which is a beautiful ripple. So I'd like to just end on a more personal question for you, given the body of work that you've done, retracing through history, people's roots, have you done any of that for yourself? Have you made any connections in that way with yourself and your background?
It's funny you should ask that. I used to joke when I was researching Michelle Obama's ancestors. I'd say to my dad, Dad, I'm sorry, I'm gonna do a little digging here on the side, but I gotta focus on them. And I'll tell you a story from that time. Michelle Obama had ancestors who were free before the Civil War, and for a while I was really interested in trying to figure out who in her family, who were the first voters in her family. And I remember searching. I was actually in Chicago at the Newberry Library, and she had family free ancestors in North Carolina. And there was a book of registrations of voters, free Black people after the war. This is 1867. And my dad's family is from North Carolina. And I just said, well, and there he was, my great, I can't remember now if it's 3 or 4 greats-grandfather who registered to vote in 1867. And it was such a moment, for me. You don't know if he did vote. He was approved as a voter. As we know, as I know, looking at that, you think to yourself, gosh, I know what he didn't know when he registered to vote, which was that opportunity, that privilege, that possibility was going to be closing. And so I don't know that, but I ran out of that library and called my dad to let him know that.
That is amazing. That
Yeah.
is just, again, it kind of speaks to this whole idea of the resilience and the strength of the people in spite of the pain and through the pain that they have to live their lives by. Well, thank you so much. I'm now going to open this up for conversation, for questions. And this is the part I'm most worried about, managing this screen, but we'll see how it goes. I think I am going to have to wear these not very helpful glasses. Let's see. One of the largest, yes, here's a good one from Carolyn. She says, you refer to the sale of the 272 as, quote, one of the largest documented slave sales in the nation, unquote. What were the financial consequences of this sale, and what were the human consequences?
So one of the things that made this book possible, like I mentioned, it's really hard if you're trying to research enslaved people because, again, forced into illiteracy by practice or law, and then, newspapers at the time aren't writing about their milestones and happenings, etc. So it's really challenging. One of the things that makes this possible is that the Jesuits were very good record keepers. They kept very, very detailed records, and as I mentioned, you have this crazy thing where they kind of care about the soul and are happy to enslave and buy and sell the body. But because they did care about the soul and about the sacraments, there were those sacramental records too. And so, that allowed a great deal of research and possibility. So this sale, there's never enough, but a lot of records to deal with, and so that's why it's one of the most documented. Um, and it had profound implications. One of the new head of Georgetown's new institute on slavery said that basically that Georgetown owes its existence to this sale, and the Jesuits themselves, who were really in dire financial shape at the time, also were helped financially to survive and then again to build as a result of this sale. So it was a very important sale for Georgetown and the Jesuits.
Carolyn also asks, which builds on this answer, what was the lot of the enslaved Blacks different, or was it different in Maryland than it was in the Deep South where they were shipped?
Right. Excellent question. And the priests talk about this. So one of the things that was so terrifying to these families who are hearing all about, this sale that's coming any day now, is that they know very well, as most enslaved people did, about what the conditions were down south, in the Deep South, and far, far harsher conditions, higher rates of disease and mortality, and really brutal, brutal working conditions. And the priests talk about this as they're debating it, saying, we know that, they know that, this is really an awful thing, and that they do not want this. So both the priests and the enslaved were well aware of those differences, very stark differences.
So we have a question from Bob. I find it very interesting. Were the slaves owned, quote unquote, and by the individuals, or by the institution itself?
Wonderful question. So, both in a way, which is so the Jesuits actually set up a corporation which still exists, Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen, and that corporation was, technically, owned the land and the people, but in the records, for instance, local records of a particular county, for instance, individual priests are described as landholders, like they and as property owners of these people. They were the people who ran the plantation and actually had to pay the taxes and turn in the paperwork to the county, of which they did, which is super helpful in terms of records, in terms of the property they owned and the value of their property. And so it is both. Like sometimes individual Father Carberry is listed as an owner of people. But when I mentioned that last record where Louisa, the younger sister, in the after the war, is among the last of the enslaved people described as owned by the Jesuits. She's described as owned by the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen.
Okay, so there's one more question, and then I have a parting question I'd like to ask. Carolyn, again, who happens to have read your book ahead of this day, she asks, let me see if I can read it. How did the Catholic Church in Rome finally rule on the sale of the 272 slaves in Maryland? And I want to piggyback on that and say, did the church ever take a formal public stance on slavery? And when and what was that?
So it was, you've got Father Milady, this American-born Jesuit, who was a leader, the church, and as president of Georgetown in the 1830s, early 1830s, pushing. He's got this vision. He wants to make it a reality. He's got powerful allies pressing Rome. Rome is not, the leader of the Jesuits in Rome is not certain that this is a good idea. There's opposition. He knows that there's opposition. He also even worries, again, to show that, there was not consensus that this was a good idea. And there are questions of the morality of it. He says something like it would be terrible to lose our souls in this because of this sale. I mean, there's a real sense that, it's not just profits on the line here. It is their souls that might be on the line here. So it takes a while. And actually, while Rome ponders, the Jesuits start selling small groups of people. Like they just start selling people. They can't do the whole big sale, but they start kind of selling as best they can to raise money. Rome is finally persuaded that this is the only way out of the economic disaster that they're in, that Georgetown will not survive, that the Maryland Jesuits the province that they ran might not survive. He puts some real conditions, though, because again, he's worried. He's worried about, what the Lord is going to think of this. So he puts conditions. He says families cannot be separated. This money should not be used for debts or other kind of worldly things. And those conditions are broken, during the sale.
So I would like to end by asking you, going back to the ripple effect, do you think that your book and the responses it has engendered are having an effect on the African American population as a whole, apart from the universities, apart from Catholicism per se? Do you think it's having some greater societal impact?
What I would say is that Georgetown has, certainly been a leader in what has become a fledgling movement of institutions, particularly starting with faith institutions, to try to grapple with this history. And there are now more than 90 colleges. There's a consortium now, universities studying slavery, now looking at their history, trying to reckon with this history. So I think that Georgetown and the Jesuits, and I should say that descendants are not uniformly cheering all of this. It's more than 6,000 people. There are a lot of opinions, a lot of people who feel like not enough is being done, as well as those who really feel like it's meaningful. So I do think that a lot of institutions they were in the forefront of what has been emerging around the country, as all kinds of institutions are reckoning with slavery. It's not just Georgetown, and I always like to say, it's not just the Catholic Church, right? Sometimes people, I feel like, want to shake me by the shoulders and say, because I'm Catholic still, right? How can you stay? And I'm kind of like, where would I go? Because the Episcopalians enslaved people, the Quakers enslaved people before they didn't, right? And so there is this reckoning happening, not just with Georgetown, among many universities. Harvard's working on this right now. Yale, and not just the Catholic Church, and not just universities and religious institutions. You have banks, insurance companies, municipalities, right? The state of New York, the state of California, setting up commissions to look at this history and to try and think about, how we grapple with this in the here and now. So I think that, Georgetown was certainly in the forefront of that.
So that must be very gratifying to know that you have helped launch this whole new movement and effort in the country. So,
well, I'm old school. I'm not a pat myself on the back person. I would say it's important to know that Georgetown had been thinking about grappling with its history before I started writing about it. It is certainly true that my reporting, though, brought this out to the national stage and made it a national conversation, and I'd like to think contributed to some of the events that followed.
Rachel, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. We really appreciate your insights and all this. It's not data, it's knowledge. It's really what you bring to all these disparate facts and how you pull them all together. We really thank you for that. And before we go, I'm going to let everyone know about our next Fridays at 1 program. It will be on Friday, February 21st. That's in the year 2025, if we can hardly believe that. Our guest will be Clifford Young, president of Ipsos Public Affairs, which is a leading public opinion firm in the US and globally. He's also adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He will be sharing new data and perspectives on Americans' opinions and expectations in the US, and particularly at this critical juncture. So thank you to everyone, and thank you again, Rachel, and we'll see you in February.